we are honored we have with us Professor Seema. She's one of the key person researching on very important issue of this environmental conservation, gender equality, and other microeconomic topics, especially related to developing country. She served on the board of director of the JPAL, and she also led so many other projects and also the co-editor of NBER. So we are honored. We welcome formally to Professor on our forum. PIDE is one of the leading think tank in Pakistan, and you might visit our website. We work on very diverse issue, ranging from this climate issue, from sludge, from bureaucratic issues, and also more of major economic challenges that we have. So we have this series of PIDE webinar where we invited intellectual like you to enlighten us in terms of where is the policy right now, how we can get the benefit of the research conducted in developed countries, especially like JPAL and other RCTs, how we can be benefited. And with the context of this climate, let me just briefly explain Pakistan's situation in terms of climate. Pakistan is one of the highly vulnerable country in terms of climate. Look at the flood series over the last 3 to 4 decades. More recently, we have a massive flood in 2022. Apart from that, there is another agriculture productivity issue that we are facing related with the climate change. And the issue of this water is emerging in terms of the climatic issue. And the one of the key highlight that we have in Pakistan in the last few years, we have initiated this series of afforestation across over the country. It was initiated in one province, then expanded to the other province. This shows that we realize there is a need to work on these issues. And a few days back, government of Pakistan has launched first a policy on this carbon market and how we can integrate it into this. And this scope is one of the key highlight where we presented our case to the rest of the field. With these, over to Professor for enlightening us.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction and that valuable context, Dr. Iqbal. And thank you for the opportunity to present to this knowledgeable and diverse audience. So I'm not an expert on Pakistan, but hopefully what I'm talking about has some relevance for you as you think about those questions like carbon markets, tapping carbon markets in Pakistan. What I'm going to talk about, I've titled it Global Bargains for Reducing Carbon Emissions in Low and Middle Income Countries. So I'm going to aim to talk for about 40 or 45 minutes and then have questions. And so this is about what I'm focusing on. There are two sides of climate change. There is the effects of climate change, and what do we do policy-wise to be resilient to those climate shocks, so to recover from them or to adapt to them so that they don't harm us as much in the first place. And then the other side is mitigation or reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm going to mostly focus on, or almost exclusively focus on, that second piece of reducing carbon emissions. So as everybody knows, climate change is a truly global problem. And we like to throw that term around of global problems, but especially within environmental problems, climate change is really quite unique. If we have particulate matter that's causing smog, and that might blow across boundaries, across borders, but it's mostly going to affect the people where the source of pollution is. Climate change means that a country like Pakistan can experience these floods or heat waves, even though the vast majority of those carbon emissions didn't come from Pakistan or didn't come from low and middle income countries, but came from today's wealthy countries. So that makes it challenging to solve because there's a blame game and there's a temptation to free ride. And on this point of, who are the contributors to climate change, I think this is a well-known fact, but today's richest countries today account for about a third. The richest 10% of countries in terms of population account for over a third of current emissions. And if we think about historically what brought us to this point where the levels of the stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is so high, then it becomes even a much larger share coming from high-income countries. And yet the bitter irony of this is that it's going to be the global poor who are especially hard hit by climate change. So if we didn't have any adaptation, there are going to be more climate shocks in poor countries, partly because of geography, hotter temperatures to begin with. If temperatures rise, that's going to be more harmful. And also just the mix of all industries. Being a professor, there's lots of evidence you're less productive when it's hot, but certain industries like agriculture are more weather dependent. But another big reason is that climate change is here, and so we're really in the business of how do we become resilient, the ex post piece of this, of recovering, or how do we adapt, the ex ante part of this. And if you have fewer financial resources, as a government to invest in levees or other infrastructure, a seawall, or as a household, if you have fewer financial resources to buy an air conditioner so that you are still comfortable, not dangerously exposed to heat, that's going to mean you're going to be more exposed. And there's also evidence that it's not just through the obvious channels of direct economic ones, but the heat per se and its economic effects can affect political upheaval. So, at least from historical climate shocks, weather shocks, we know that it can lead to less democratic transitions. And so if, it's rich to say this in the US at this moment, but, if on average, low and middle income countries have more political fragility, that can be another danger of climate change of leading to political upheaval. Okay, just as one piece of evidence of this fact that, or projection really, of this point that climate change is going to be especially hard on low and middle income countries, there's the economic effects, like if a lot of your economy is agriculture. This is a different measure, which is just mortality. And this really comes from, why is there more mortality in these red toned countries? So in sub-Saharan Africa, you see Pakistan is dark there as well. It's partly geography. You can see it's the northern countries are more protected, but it's also the baseline health is worse. The healthcare system, the resources to spend on healthcare. So the majority of the mortality burden of climate change is going to hit low and middle income countries. Okay, so who should pay for climate change mitigation? This is really stepping aside from economics and just saying, if you it's a fact that poor countries are not to blame for the problem. It's also a fact that paying to solve it, to invest in climate change mitigation projects, would impose the largest hardship on poor countries. That just follows from having concave utility, the value of that government budget to provide basic healthcare, basic education, versus more luxury goods in rich countries. You put those two together, I think there's a pretty strong moral case that rich countries ought to be shouldering most of the burden of mitigating climate change. It's above my pay grade. It's obviously this is one of the things that gets debated at COP, and there certainly the current politics is that every country is going to do its fair share. But what I'm going to kind of focus on is just thinking through the lens of, suppose we do get to this world where rich countries are shouldering most of the economic burden. What does that mean in terms of where climate change mitigation should take place? And what I'm drawing on is an article that Rachel Glenister and I wrote in the Journal of Economic Perspectives last year, where we just lay out a pretty simple point that you can decouple who pays for climate change mitigation and where that mitigation takes place. And a lot of the low-cost ways to mitigate climate change are going to be in low and middle income countries. So, this is almost turning the problem of climate change being a global problem into an upside. The other side of the coin is that when something is a truly global problem, there's an opportunity that if you want, as say the US government, to reduce your carbon emissions, you reduce global atmospheric levels of carbon dioxide the exact same amount if you reduce it in Uganda or Pakistan as if you pursue a project within the borders of the US. And so that means that, you can think about a global marketplace. The payers might be the US or Europe or Australia, but they could be funding mitigation projects. They should be funding mitigation projects from a optimization point of view, wherever the most cost-effective opportunities are. And most of those low-cost opportunities are, or many of them, are going to be in low and middle income countries. And I'm going to sort of lay out the quite basic economic reasons, or some of them, for why that is. So to do that, I'm going to sort of use this framework of a marginal abatement cost curve, which if you work on climate change, you've seen many times, but for those who are less familiar with it, it's basically a supply curve that's used to depict all of the ways all of our different projects or categories of projects to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so they're lined up with the least expensive ones on the left of this horizontal axis and the more expensive ones on the right. And the width of the bar is how big of an opportunity is that? Is this something that's a major source of emissions, so that if we remove it or make it more efficient, we have lots of savings in terms of tons of carbon dioxide emitted? Or the narrower bars are going to be smaller opportunities. And then the height of the bar is the cost to reduce a ton. So it's ordered in the way from cheapest to most expensive, because that's how a supply curve should work, in terms of, we would expect, in a supply curve case, through market forces, but even an individual actor choosing what to pursue should start with the cheapest things first and then go to the most expensive ones. And I'm going to lay out 3 broad reasons why the curve is going to be shifted to the left. It's going to be cheaper on average, or lots of things on the left here will be in low and middle income countries. One is that some of the low-hanging fruit hasn't been picked yet. Some of the cheap opportunities are still available. The second is that land and labor are less expensive in low and middle income countries. They're non-tradable factors of production. They're often inputs into the production of environmental benefits, to projects that are protecting the environment. And so those kinds of projects will just be cheaper in places where those inputs are cheaper. And then it's maybe the simplest one to explain is that it's cheaper to build green from the get-go than to retrofit, whether that's a transportation system or housing or other infrastructure. And most of the infrastructure growth to expect in the future is going to be in low and middle income countries, both because the installed infrastructure is smaller, so there's more to be done. This is the point of higher growth rates, more development, and then also just population growth will be higher. Okay, so what do I mean by the low-hanging fruit hasn't been picked, or less of it has been picked in low and middle income countries? Some kind of, the way we've made some progress on climate change mitigation, reducing emissions, is that countries have unilaterally, or because of their Paris Agreement commitments, have started to pursue projects to clean up the environment. They've subsidized electric vehicles or solar power or what have you. And to do that, most of those are not, or some of they're costing something. You're paying taxes, you're taxing your population to fund those subsidies for electric vehicles. And the willingness to pay for that is going to vary across countries. The willing to tax people to have less take-home pay so that you can protect the environment and really contribute to a global public good, that's going to vary across countries. So you see countries like Norway or Sweden being, ahead of the curve here, or the US doing some things. And I think it makes sense that low and middle income countries just have not, haven't taken as much of their government budget to do this. And so that just means that, if you think of this as like, this is your willingness to pay, and a country was doing all the projects or aimed to do all the projects below its willingness to pay, then the marginal project that hasn't been done yet in a rich country, if it's done all these, it's going to be this gray-blue bar, it's going to be more expensive than a low and middle income country where the marginal project that hasn't been pursued yet is cheaper. So, very basic economics that there's still some of these cheap opportunities in low and middle income countries. What are examples of that? I think, putting in regulations about clean air so that are nudging electricity generation plants to switch from coal to cleaner fossil fuels, or going from cleaner fossil fuels to something like onshore wind power. Those are things that are, in the grand scheme of things, relatively cheap ways to clean up the carbon emissions, but they still are costly. And we see that those opportunities are starting to be pursued in rich countries, less so in poor countries. And so you can imagine, rather than kind of spending more money to get those marginal transitions in the US, you could try to subsidize those transitions in a country where they're earlier in that transition. The way these curves are often depicted is unusual for a supply curve, and that there are these negative cost opportunities. So that's controversial, in the sense of, or it should be a puzzle to economists of, if there's a negative cost opportunity, what does that mean? It means that from the point of view of the firm or the government or the individual, the household, it's not a cost to do something that's better for the environment. It's actually a benefit. It's a win-win. They could do something and make money, save money, and also protect the environment. And so then it's a puzzle of what does it mean to for it not to be taken advantage of. So in some cases, maybe these are some of the instances that are emphasized as negative costs might not be, but there probably are. There are certainly examples where people show that, once you nudge someone to do something for the environment, they end up being better off as well. And so why are these negative cost opportunities not pursued? They exist in both rich and poor countries, but maybe more of them exist in poorer countries. And so that's why I've made the bar wider in the low and middle income countries. And there are, a few reasons, but I think the big ones are probably capital constraints and regulatory capacity. So examples of these are energy efficient appliances. Once you buy a more energy efficient refrigerator or light bulb, you make up the costs of the transition, the capital stock, by having a lower energy bill. And many of those transitions actually pay for themselves pretty quickly. There's, kind of just making firms more efficient. So they're thinking about how to optimize their production to save energy. Again, that should just be privately beneficial in terms of the lower energy costs. And then it has the side benefit for the world of we're using less energy. There's methane capture from landfills. If you there's methane's a very potent greenhouse gas, and it's emitted as organic material decays. You can capture that and use as an energy source, or it can be emitted, and if you can repurpose that energy, that can be productive. Or the loss of methane or natural gas as through oil and gas production, that's another thing where you could use that as a productive something productive you capture rather than having it be emitted into the atmosphere. So, why do we need policy intervention? So one is, several of these ideas require upfront investment. So to put in the equipment to have a methane capture, or to buy the new air conditioner or refrigerator that's more energy efficient, you pay some upfront costs, and then the benefits come over time through the lower energy bills. And so from an NPV point of view, with a well-functioning credit market, that looks like a positive NPV project. But if you don't have that upfront capital, you can't do that. So as a small example of this, there's research through a JPAL randomized control trial in Kenya, where by subsidizing people to get a more fuel efficient cook stove, they paid back the value of that. They earned back the value of that cook stove within a year by having lower charcoal costs. Yet people didn't have the money to buy that cook stove up front. So, you could subsidize, in this case, an NGO could subsidize them for that cook stove, and then you both reduced poverty because those families were then spending less on charcoal, and you had a lot less emissions. I think the one that's maybe most puzzling and or not puzzling, but sort of striking to me is that I think a lot of times it's just something we have a hard time explaining as economists, but some sort of behavioral bias of inertia, where like giving the example of light bulbs, some people don't like LEDs or more energy efficient, the color of the lighting, but some of it is just inertia or maybe misinformation, underestimating the benefits. And so we don't get the transition to more energy efficient light bulbs by people doing the calculation and figuring out they can save money. We get it because the US basically banned incandescent light bulbs, or taking more energy efficient, fuel efficient cars. People should say like, oh, I want a fuel efficient car because I'm going to save so much money in gasoline. It's going to be well worth it. That's not how we got more fuel efficient cars in the US. We got it through regulation, CAFE standards that required the car manufacturers to have more fuel efficient cars. And then there are some knock-on benefits to people. So this, I think, is both an opportunity and something that you can imagine, or it helps explain why there are more of these negative cost opportunities in low and middle income countries, because that regulation to regulate the fleet of cars that are on the road, or to ban one type of light bulb and so that people have to use a different kind of light bulb, that regulatory capacity is something that for all of its faults, the US has a pretty well developed regulatory infrastructure, and that has been valuable for protecting the environment. So even beyond climate change, there's nice evidence that why is the wildfires aside, why is the air so much cleaner in the US in terms of particulate matter now versus the 70s or even the 90s? It's regulation and enforcement of that regulation. As an aside, as I said, I'm kind of framing this as where should Europe or the US be pursuing? What kind of projects should the US and Europe be pursuing? Maybe it's trying to get more landfills to have methane capture, or more use of energy efficient appliances in Pakistan or Ghana. But these projects that are true win-wins because they're negative costs. These are also the ones where a low and middle income country government should be willing to self-fund, because just leaving aside the global benefits from climate change, just the local benefits exceed the costs. That's what it means to be negative costs. And okay, so as an example of this, there's a nice recent paper done by a team at Berkeley and Stanford on energy efficient brick kilns in Bangladesh. So as people probably know, and I'm sure it's similar in Pakistan, when bricks are made, there's a whole lot of pollution, both particulate matter, the dust, but also the energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. And so this was a case where there are well-known practices or well-established practices that can improve the energy efficiency of brick kilns. And so this was an intervention where brick kiln owners were taught these practices that could improve energy efficiency. Some of it is a zigzag pattern of laying bricks. It's also by having continuous feeding of the oven, so that rather than having one person where you have some breaks and pauses, if you have a team of 2 or 3 people who are switching off and having continuous use, then you don't have this sort of wasted energy during these breaks, essentially. And they found that people weren't forced to adopt these new practices, but once taught these practices, many kiln owners adopted them, and they found that on average, among the people who were taught these new practices, their energy use fell by 10 to 20%. And energy was by far the most expensive input in the production function. So this increased the profits. It also had some local benefits. It reduced, so those carbon benefits are global, but locally there was less particulate matter, and that meant better working conditions for the workers. So, either that's going to mean there's this benefit for workers of being healthier. It might also be another source of profits if the compensating wage differential you need to pay is lower. And so this was a relatively inexpensive intervention of paying $166 per kiln to do the training. There's probably a way to reduce that cost. And because it was relatively cheap and led to this big reduction in energy use, it was able to reduce carbon emissions for just $1 per ton. So, that's very low. The social cost of carbon is somewhere around the order of $200. And, this is lower than most of the carbon credit markets are where what the price is. And so this is a case where, if you could pursue this project, you could get funding from externally for either bilateral aid or carbon markets. And in addition to creating this global public good of less carbon emissions, you get these local benefits of more profitable brick kilns, less particulate matter, and healthier workers in brick kiln in the brick industry. Okay, so the next reason why there are a lot of cheap opportunities is that labor and land are cheaper in low and middle income countries. And so the exact same activity, if you pursued it and it was requiring labor and land, it's going to be cheaper in low and middle income countries than in rich countries. So if we're thinking, where should we pursue this? Should we build a big solar farm to do direct air capture? It's going to take a ton of land. Should we do that where the price of land is really high or the price of land is really low? It's just going to be cheaper if we do it where the price of land is low. So the example I've worked on the most and I'll talk about is avoided deforestation. And then there's the related idea of afforestation that was mentioned. So, forests take up land and that land has other uses, and whether that's for agriculture or an industrial park, and how valuable that land is. We create the same trees are sequestering the same amount of carbon. The cost efficiency of that is going to depend on the alternative uses of that land. There are examples, one I just mentioned, of solar farms. So their carbon removal technologies today are very expensive. None of them are really cost effective, but eventually, hopefully they will be. To make any sense, to actually be good for the environment, the idea is that they're very energy intensive, but if you power them from renewable energy, then you can, and you have direct air capture and sequester it, you can have net carbon removal. Where are you gonna, where can you site those? It's going to be someplace where you can have a very, by hydropower, or where you can have a very large solar farm. And that land is going to be on average cheaper in poorer countries. And, there are also agricultural practices that are very, very labor intensive or more labor intensive, but they reduce the amount of chemical fertilizer that's needed and nitrogen. And so therefore, greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're trading off emissions for someone's time, and that time, is going to be priced at a higher rate in a rich country than a poor country. And so, you don't want people to lose their own income, but these are just, whether it's in a rich or poor country, but it's an opportunity to kind of compensate people for time they're putting in to protect the environment, and, sort of paying someone who has a lower cost of labor to do that, rather than being able to do less of that in a rich country. So I'll talk for a few minutes about a project of mine. I have several projects that are using financial incentives to protect forests. So asking people or offering people an opportunity to protect forests in low and middle income countries where it's most cost effective, compensating them so that they're not financially worse off, and finding that this is a very cheap way to reduce carbon emissions. So deforestation is responsible for about 10% of carbon emissions. And clearing forests also has private benefits to the individual who owns the forest. So where I've worked, it's not government forest reserves or even community forests, it's households own land that is forested, and they don't value the environmental benefits per se, or they certainly don't and shouldn't value them as much as the entirety of the world population values them. And so when they think about the cost benefit privately, it makes sense to use that, clear that forest and have more land for agriculture, or clear that land and sell those trees to timber dealers, and use it in construction, or in East Africa where I've worked, it's often used for charcoal as a heating source. So you could ban deforestation, you could use regulation, but that's often ineffective. But even more so, it has the real downside that when you regulate or ban something, you're imposing the cost of environmental protection on that person who has to change their behavior. So someone who was using that money from their agriculture to feed their family, or selling charcoal to pay for their hospital bills, now they have less money. So someone who's very poor just became poorer. And, that's ethically, undesirable. And so the policy that's often used instead is to compensate people. So using a carrot rather than a stick. So this is often called payments for ecosystem services. So a payment for a service for the ecosystem or for the environment. It's, basically just a financial incentive where what you're being incentivized to do is protect the environment. So if you own forest, you get paid if you keep that forest intact. So this is, one of the projects I did was a randomized control trial of this payments for ecosystem services, or PES, in Uganda, Western Uganda, where we had some treatment villages where we tried out this program, and then another 60 control villages that were the status quo without the program. And in the treatment villages, an NGO offered this program where households that owned primary forest were offered $28 per hectare per year if they kept the forest standing. And so the NGO would go and check if the forest had been cleared. They had a team on the ground who would go and check. You can now today also use drones or satellite imagery. And, the idea was that this $28 per hectare for some people was going to be more than they would have earned by cutting the forest and growing more cassava or selling more trees to charcoal dealers. And at the same time, the $28 per hectare, that was a bargain globally to keep that forest intact, because the social value of that carbon was much higher than that amount that was paid to them, plus even the administrative costs of the program. So what did we find? We found that in the control villages, so the status quo, over 2 years of this study, 9% of the forest was deforested. So that's a very high rate of deforestation. If 2 years you lose 9% of the forest, playing that out, in 20 years, there's going to be no forest left. And that is bad for biodiversity in addition to climate change. In the treatment villages, we see that we reduced the deforestation by over 50%. There was still deforestation, but in some sense, that makes sense. It wasn't a ban. It didn't require people to stop deforesting. It was just offering people a deal. If this is going to be in your best interest, you can take it up. Some people said very productive farmers would still turn down the program and keep expanding their agriculture. That makes sense. This is the value of market-based policies, that we get people who are very efficient farmers, or land that's very efficient for agriculture, to be used in agriculture, and then land or farmers who are not as productive, they specialize in forest conservation. So we're getting this nice allocative efficiency as well. So you can kind of think about the hectares of tree cover that were saved because of this program. You can turn it into the tons of carbon dioxide that are sequestered instead of being emitted into the atmosphere. And then you could think about the social value of that. So using today's social cost of carbon of about $200, the benefit of this is about 70 times the cost of it. So really high benefit to cost ratio. Or another way of saying it is it's about $3 to permanently avert a ton of CO2 emissions. So again, very, very cheap in the grand scheme of things. And so coming back to this land and labor costs, and here the most important input into this is land. And land is much more expensive in the US than in Uganda. So when there's a very similar program called the Conservation Reserve Program in the US, and that's more than 10 times as expensive to achieve the same goal, or even higher than that. So it's the exact same kind of program. You could pursue either one. The US government puts a lot of money into the Conservation Reserve Program. They're getting like 1/10 of the benefits by doing it in the US, instead of trying to fund the same kind of project in Uganda or Pakistan or India or what have you. Okay, so the last reason I'll mention is that building green is cheaper than retrofitting. If you think about it, if you know in advance you want to have passive cooling so that the building is cool, you can plan for that. If you don't think about something and then you decide after the fact, you have fewer options, and so it's going to be more expensive. And so a lot of the opportunities to have green buildings, public transport are going to be in low and middle income countries. And so these are expensive. These might be cases where you can get private financing, but they're going to be important opportunities globally for having less emissions. Okay, so just to recap, I think funding these low-cost opportunities would allow the exact same carbon emissions for less money. So that's one political framing. We could tax people less in Europe and the US and achieve the same amount. Or you can, you could, I flip this around, you could achieve the same carbon emissions for less money, or you can achieve with the same amount of money more carbon emissions and get us closer to the targets we need. So, just as another way to think about the money that's being left on the table, the big piece of legislation in the US to really make a lot of progress on carbon emissions reductions was the Inflation Reduction Act. And the estimates are that on average, all of that $1 trillion of spending in the US, the cost per averted ton of CO2 on average is $51. So when we think about these opportunities in the Uganda of $3 per ton, or the one I mentioned in Bangladesh of $1 a ton, there might not be enough of that to get all of the benefits. You can't get the entirety of the IRA's goals at these $1 to $3, but you should certainly pursue the $1 to $3 ones instead of the marginal ones that are costing you, $100 a ton or what have you. So, the last point I want to make is that there's a real risk in talking about this, that, for development aid to be diverted towards this funding. So, this isn't development aid, it's a way to spend the environmental budget more wisely. What development aid would be is on the adaptation resilience piece of climate change, helping people have levees or seawalls, or even better healthcare systems, so that when heat waves come, people are in better health. So just to kind of illustrate this point about double counting, let me go back to this Uganda example, because I think it's a nice way of sort of seeing this point that how much you spend on climate change mitigation isn't the same as the actual benefits for the people in that low and middle income country. So when you pay forest owners in Uganda, if they conserve, some people were going to conserve anyway. Those are the inframarginal payments, but you're never going to have environmental benefits unless some people had to change their behavior. They would have been cutting their forest. We wouldn't have seen a treatment effect unless some people were going to cut their trees, but because they were offered this payment, they changed their behavior and conserved. And so then the payments aren't making those people richer. They're just offsetting their costs to protect the environment. Instead of getting revenue from selling charcoal, they're getting this money from the NGO. And it was probably more money, that's why they took it up, but it might have been, 2% more, not 100% of that money wasn't making them richer. So, I think there's a risk of, in a lot of this dialogue, of thinking that everything's a win-win. So the real goal of paying people to protect the environment is so that you're not exacerbating poverty. So I think of it as a win neutral. It's a win for the environment, a cheap way to protect the environment, and it should be neutral in terms of poverty reduction. So there's going to be some poverty reduction, but that's going to be, in these cases where we failed to meet our environmental goal, when we were paying people who would have conserved their forest anyway. So, any single dollar is either causing someone to change their behavior and protect the environment more, so that's an environmental win, or it's being made to someone who was going to do that behavior anyway, and it's inframarginal to their conservation, but it was extra money for them. So it's either protecting the environment or reducing poverty. So you can see this in the PES example. Let me just jump to this slide and say that, this is going back to that data from the Uganda randomized control trial. And what I've done here is divided all of the forest owners based on whether, had there been no program, they would have conserved anyway, or the ones in the blue are the ones who would have cut down the forest. So how do you do this? In the control group, what they would have done without this program because they didn't get the program. And you can use machine learning techniques. So we have baseline data, lots of rich data on people. We have the control group and the treatment group. Using the control group data, we can predict, using our covariates, our baseline data, what would someone have done? What are the predictors of conserving the forest or cutting down the forest? So low predicted forest income is using what we're targeting is we're predicting the income they got from their forest. You can also do the exact same exercise where you predict actual cutting of trees. And so once you have that prediction, you can then you can just use the predicted value both for the control group and the treatment group. And so this is useful because the treatment group, we don't see in the real world what they would have done without the PES program because they were offered the PES program, but we know a sense of that individual household's counterfactual. And so what you could see is the left, these are the people who were going to protect the forest with or without the program. And you could see the vertical axis here is a measure of their economic well-being. This is a self-reported question, how comfortable are you economically? We can also use more objective data like their expenditures on food. We see something similar. So for the people who were going to protect the forest anyway, getting this money to protect the forest is just free money, and they're actually better off. They're richer. So the treatment group is better off economically than the control group. The blue bars are the people who were predicted to cut their forest had you not offered them PES. So here, what do you see is that there's no economic benefit for being in the treatment group. It's just neutral. You were neither richer nor poorer. So if you think about this, both of these groups got money for protecting the forest. But if we wanted to think about how much actually was development aid, how much was helping people, it was a subset of that money. It was just these folks who got an economic benefit, and it's the folks on the left in the green bars who are giving us the environmental benefits. So, zooming out, PES is one example, but the broader point is that, that the real reason to pursue this policy is that there was a large global benefit from climate change. You conserved a lot of forest and then sequestered a lot of carbon. The local climate change benefit in Uganda is tiny. Uganda is tiny in the grand scheme of the global economy. There were some local economic gains. There were these inframarginal payments, so some net income to some people. Maybe 20% of the money that was transferred was actually making people richer. There were also some local benefits of forest conservation, like less soil erosion. And so any of these projects, like afforestation in Pakistan, they have some costs. Some of that might be actual benefits for local people. Maybe you're creating some job creation or paying people to maintain those trees. Some things, if that land had other uses, like for agriculture, then, that's not a net benefit. That's just kind of compensating. It's just payment for an input that you're using. So, if we have a solar farm, for example, if that land had some other value, if you're paying the rent on that land and it's exactly the same as what it could, the market clearing rate of rent, that's not a net benefit. Or if you're importing solar panels from China, that's not a local economic boost in wherever that is coming. You have to be careful about just counting what's actually a net benefit. And so I think this distinction is important because, we're seeing this with multilaterals. There's a real risk that development aid is getting co-opted to addressing climate change, not adaptation and resilience, but mitigation. And so, if that's going to happen, I think there should be a lot of sunshine about that happening. And the way to be rigorous about this is to make this distinction between how much was spent on the project versus how much was an actual local economic benefit in the recipient country. So just to wrap up, globally, we can decouple where to pursue climate change mitigation and who pays for it. That can happen through carbon markets. It can happen through bilateral deals. And, a lot of the cheap opportunities are going to be in low and middle income countries. The risk is this double counting. And so, we should be using money earmarked for local domestic climate change mitigation if governments are doing this. And also focus on projects with local co-benefits in terms of job creation or local environmental benefits. And of course, this vision of rich countries funding all of this is overly optimistic, I realize. And so low and middle income countries will, of course, pursue climate change mitigation on their own, funded, a green transition. But the similar reasoning is true. We should be prioritizing the projects that are low cost and the ones with larger non-climate co-benefits so that, there's less of a trade-off, it's less of an economic cost, and maybe even, an economic win from pursuing this green transition. So thanks a lot.
And thank you for excellent presentation. Like it's opened a lot of questions for us as how the developing country would finance these projects, especially related to climate change. So let me start with a very basic, this question of financing these projects as you explained. Then we come back to more of a global phenomena, how the global players are doing some sort of gambling on the name of this climate financing. So let's first try to unpack this subsidy component that, as you mentioned, that if we pay something to these farmers like that, they're probably inclined to protect these forests. So while I was evaluating this billion tree project, that, as I mentioned at the very upfront, so one of the key takeaway from that study probably will make that public in the coming months or so, that there are two main outcomes that we were considering. One is the take up and the plantation count, how much they are actually planted, and other was the survival rate. So when we do some sort of experimental analysis on the plantation side, they planted more number of trees because these were the free trees. So the government basically subsidized these services either by providing the free plantation, free seedling, or give some sort of other services to look after those things. But when we do analysis on the survival rate was much lower among the beneficiaries compared to the non-beneficiaries. So then there is a question of trade-off. Where would be the trade-off in terms of either we should go for the large number of plantation, or we consider this the survival rate? Because as you said, the land itself has a value. So if you really plant so many trees, it would definitely have a trade-off with the other agriculture product that you can earn. So how we can create a balance in terms of these things? Because if you are suggesting that $28 maybe at the upfront cost For developing country, it would be very high how they can finance with these things. But if they really go for financing these type of projects, how they can create a balance on the optimal utilization of these subsidies, because subsidies always have some concern when we talk about the economic cost of these subsidies.
Yeah, exactly. So just as a factual question, were people compensated for having surviving trees, or it was just that the seedlings were given to them subsidized or free?
It was seedling, just they give them the seedling.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think, this is one where I think from the landowner's point of view, maybe once you get the free seedling, from that point of view, thinking forward, they have to invest some time to maintain the tree. They might have to learn how to maintain the trees, and they have to spend some time doing it. And then just using, homo economicus, that's worthwhile for them if the private benefits of having that tree exceed those costs. And, my guess is in this case, it probably doesn't. Maybe for some cases, those trees were helping as shade trees or something, improving the soil fertility. But, I guess it sounds like, there have been other programs that give the subsidized seedlings, but then also compensate people for survival of trees. So, you sort of said, oh, like, you can think of that as like paying you for your labor to keep the trees alive with performance pay, so that if you get bad luck and your trees die, you get less pay, but, there are lots of performance pay. So, in some ways it seems like it was, asking too much of people to, or at least for everyone, it just sounds like for some people, they either didn't have the skill, or they didn't have their time wasn't compensated, so they didn't invest it. I guess then when we leave aside, go to the financing piece, I think the hope is that, well-functioning carbon credit market, whether that's, under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, or it's through these voluntary carbon credits, if there is a program that can show that for whatever you have to pay, you have a contract, you give them free seedlings, maybe subsidized seedlings, and have some way of monitoring if the trees survive and compensate them, that program, all of its costs, you can conserve, you can sequester carbon for, let's call it $10 a ton, that if you can establish that, then you can tap into this international market. So the idea wouldn't be that, the government of Pakistan has to fund it. It would be, the Microsofts who are buying carbon credits, or, the government of Norway that is trying to fund projects abroad. But yeah, I think that, my co-author Kelsey Jack has some work on afforestation, and they sort of think of it as like, they model it as a technology. It's like a new technology, or a new, it's a new activity of being a tree farmer. And, people aren't equally good at it. They don't know if they're good at it. There's some uncertainty. It takes some time. And so, I guess the contractor compensation, kind of needs to match this fact that there are costs and uncertainties for the landowners.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. My question is that, as we discussed, that we can fund project, and we can fund those who are playing their role in conserving forest. And can we also compensate the developing countries in technology transfer for projects that help in less carbon emission, especially in sectors that are providing products for the developing countries or developed countries?
Yeah, no, I think that's another great way to, kind of make it easier for countries to, do you mean transferring technology or compensating for technology that's invented? But, just either way, technology innovation is a non-rival, right? So if someone comes up with a cheaper way to, I don't know, do direct air capture, that shouldn't be private intellectual property, that we want every country to use that. And so I think technology transfer is probably, making sure that there's technology transfer with anything that's, even rich to rich country, like that seems really important. So Rachel Glenister has been working on this idea of pull mechanisms, kind of advanced market commitments for carbon technology, sort of like trying to make sure that we get more innovation around, it could be, a more energy efficient scooter, or it could be carbon removal, that we have more innovation, and then that innovation is in the public domain, because that's going to lower the costs for everyone to mitigate climate change.
I think the technology is basically the key thing, especially if we're looking for the developing country. But the question that comes in mind that the changing political landscape, especially in this decade, and looking at the future, how the different players, the big players, basically shaping up their and showing their instrument in terms of dealing with this. What would be the future of this negotiation on the climate advocacy and the financing? Because currently, if there is a bipolar world related to this climate issue, on the one hand, the big players are basically, they are accusing that we are not meant to finance you, you have to accommodate by yourself. And even within that global player, there are another polar that trying to convince those ones to actually, it's our duty to help the rest of the world, because it's a global phenomenon. It don't have any boundary within that. So how you see the global players, especially the big player, would foresee this issue, and what is the level of seriousness among them in terms of addressing this issue? Then because the developing country have a different need, and I'll then come back to my own region where the three big players are fighting with each other on these climatic issues.
Yeah, you probably know more than me, so I don't have a crystal ball to have a great prediction of what will happen. I think there's no way of enforcing the Paris Agreement. So, there's no way of big players sort of forcing Pakistan or anyone to, do its part. And I think, where the leverage will be through financing. So, if there's more easy capital to build a geothermal power plant than there is to build a natural gas or coal power plant, and Pakistan wants, is looking for financing for more electricity for non-environmental reasons, then that's where the leverage will be. So, I guess, and some of that financing is going to be, in the form of development aid. Some of it's going to be private capital pursuing profits. And, I guess the piece that kind of what I've been trying, the point I was trying to make here is there's like another pot of money, which is, a few countries, who knows if that's probably not the US anymore, but, a few countries, let's call it Germany, are going to try to honor their Paris Agreement, targets. And some companies like Google are probably going to try to be net zero. And, the cheapest way for them to achieve their targets is, to not just do things in the US or in Germany, but to look across the world. And so that's like another potential source of funding for a Pakistan. And that one's not like a favor, that one doesn't, that's really a mutually beneficial gains from trade. So, that one's probably the least politically contentious. I think the challenge is more that, like, how do we make sure that this isn't just greenwashing, a way for Germany to say it's meeting its target, or Google's meeting its target. But yeah, I know. Yeah, I'd be very curious to hear your prediction of where things will play out.
So I was just like looking at the way that the political player basically shaping this agenda of the growth and the global value chain, and the way they are basically looking this, I was just looking the success of the scope, and the way they were engaged. The participation at the highest level was very minimal. So then normally they send the delegation at the very lowest level. That shows their willingness to basically lead this agenda of climate change. And probably when we talk about within our region, like China, India, and Pakistan, they are like blaming each other, especially the smoke in the last few months, and the Punjab is predicting this is your it's because of you, and they are saying it's because of you. So that's type of like the political gambling is going on, and they are trying to blame each other. And the real issue that I feel would be the climate in next 10 to 15 year or 20 year, if we pick one key element from SDGs, probably the key thing would be this climate change, because the way these are changes are occurring, especially in all over the world. Look at the current scenario, current firework in the US as well, and other calamities over there. So this would be massive, and that the only solution is to have a joint work. Otherwise, if the one party is looking for a short-term benefit, and they see my industrial base would not suffer due to these issues, probably they maybe end up with the same kind of productivity issue after 3 to 5 years, after 10 years. So that's the key thing that we really thinking at our level, because there's more of the political question rather than the economic question. The next take is on, that there is a like now the new literature is coming on this climate change with the violence extremism. So probably the forced displacement and the resource distribution after any kind of climatic issue would create some kind of conflict within the region, and the different groups basically taking benefit of those conflict to further create a multiplier effect of these things. How the global community, and especially while you are sitting in the frontier of the knowledge on these things, would see the literature would evolve on these issues.
Yeah, I think the question of internally displaced people and international migration, like climate migration, is likely to be one of the things that forces this issue, so for better, for worse, or I guess for better, when there are humanitarian crises, I guess, Sudan people are not paying a ton of attention to Sudan right now, but in general, there is international aid when people are starving in refugee camps. And so, as that increases, if that increases because of climate change, or, if there's more migration, from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe, that's harder, it's less abstract. And so it sort of forces the issue. So, it's unfortunate, because it's, that like a little bit of prevention or forethought, some strategic thinking seems like it would be a better way to address the problem than being reactive. But yeah, I don't know. One hopes that it becomes, the impetus to try to provide more assistance to low and middle income countries. But yeah, there's like a risk in the short run that it drives populism, and close borders instead. So we'll see.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for giving us a time and enlightening us on very key issue. Probably it has a two dimension. One is economics, that you very rightly explain about the benefit of this, the intervention. And if we go for like low hanging fruit, probably that would create a win-win situation for the entire global world, not only for one country. But the real questions lie with the political economy, and how political players would react to these changes. That basically that would determine the future on this climate issues and the climate financing. And probably, as you slightly mentioned, the regulation part of this whole exercise. And in most of the time, the developing countries, they are struggling with the regulation component. And in the two way, one, within their own country, they are struggling to to implement and to enforce the stuff like that. And at the global level, when they try to meet the global standard, they didn't end up with the winning that type of financing. That's the issue that we face in 2005 flood and then 2010 flood. The global community basically pledged to support us, but they have some condition, and we end up like a failure of the entire setting, and that probably need to be reconfigured how these lagging nations should be incorporated in the global picture. With these, Mark, thank you so much for your
Yeah.
time, and we look forward for further discussion.
Yeah,
Take care.
thank you very much. All right, take care,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.